The fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial hummed their mechanical prayer as Sarah Chen pushed through the employee entrance at 10:06 p.m., her badge clipped to faded scrubs that had survived for years of night shifts without fraying at the edges. She moved through the corridors with the careful invisibility of someone who'd learned long ago that being seen could be dangerous. Her face was calm. Unremarkable. The kind of face people forgot before she turned the corner. Nobody glanced up as she passed the nurses' station where 3 residents scrolled through their phones, waiting for admissions that would come like clockwork around midnight. The night shift at Houston's Oak Creek Memorial belonged to people like Sarah, the ones who arrived when the building exhaled, when the visiting families cleared out and the hospital became a cathedral of beeping monitors and whispered conversations. She clocked in and made her way to the ICU, where her assignment waited in the form of 7 stable patients and the kind of quiet that only existed between midnight and 3 in the morning. Room for 12 held a 78-year-old with congestive heart failure. Room for 14 had a post-op knee replacement patient sleeping off the anesthesia. Room for 16 was empty, sheets pulled tight as military corners. Sarah moved between them with hands that knew exactly what they were doing, steady hands that didn't shake even when the monitors spiked, hands that had muscle memory built into their very cells. She checked for lines with the precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, adjusted a saline drip, noted vitals in the electronic system with the kind of care that transformed data into narrative. Each number she entered was a sentence in a story nobody else was reading. The ER bay doors burst open at 11:14 p.m. with the squeal of paramedic wheels and the rapid-fire report of incoming. Sarah was 2 floors up, but the chaos rose through the ventilation like smoke. She'd learned to hear it in the rhythm of the overhead speakers, in the sudden absence of idle conversation below. She continued her rounds. This was not her department. This was not her problem. The night shift belonged to those who understood that invisible work was still work, that saving lives in the dark counted the same as saving them under fluorescent examination lights. But something in that arrival made her pause at the medication cart. 3 minutes later, the intercom crackled. Trauma to ER1. Trauma to ER1. Blind male, 62 years old, presenting with chest pain, shortness of breath, BP 128/74, heart rate 114, O2 sat 91% on room air. The voice was clinical. Routine. But Sarah's hand stilled over the vials she was organizing. Blind male. 62. She'd learned not to ask questions about patients who weren't hers. She'd learned that curiosity in hospitals got you reassigned, transferred, or worse. She'd learned invisibility had rules. She returned to the ICU. Room for 18 needed a blood draw. The lab work wouldn't process itself. But as she set up the tubes, she found her footsteps taking her toward the stairwell instead of the supply closet. Muscle memory, perhaps. Or something else. Something that recognized the sound of a man in crisis, a man who'd spent his life giving orders and now couldn't give himself any answers. The ER waiting area was chaos arranged in fluorescent rows, families clutching paperwork, a man with a lacerated hand wrapped in towels, a woman coughing into her elbow. Sarah stayed behind the glass partition that separated nurses from the waiting room, her presence barely registering to the crowd of the desperate and injured. She could see into ER Bay 3 from her angle, could see the paramedics transferring their patient to the hospital stretcher with practiced movements. The blind man lay there with the kind of stillness that came from having learned not to move unnecessarily through a world he couldn't see. He wore desert camouflage pants and a gray t-shirt. His cane lay across the stretcher like a rifle he'd finally set down. His face was angular, sun-darkened, and his eyes, though closed, carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been blind long enough to forget what exhaustion looked like before that happened. Dr. Patterson, the first-year resident, called across the bay, her voice tight with that specific panic of someone drowning in a case they didn't understand. Male, 62, reports sudden onset chest pain 4 hours ago, radiating to his left shoulder, came in by himself because his daughter was at work. Dr. Patterson appeared in the bay entrance with the slow reluctance of a man being called into the ocean he'd spent his life avoiding. He was in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, the kind of emergency physician who'd seen everything twice and wanted to see nothing again. He reviewed the EKG printout the resident handed him. His face changed. Not softened. Changed. The way faces change when they recognize a problem they don't want to solve. Junctional rhythm, he said quietly. Wide QRS complex. This needs cardiology. Cardiologist backed up, the resident said. 3 hours minimum. Should we admit him and wait for rounds? Patterson folded the EKG once, then again, then set it down on the rolling table beside the stretcher. That's a cardiothoracic case, he said. Get Dr. Yamamoto. I'm signing off. He was gone before anyone could respond. The resident stood there holding nothing, watching nothing, understanding that she'd just been handed a problem that had no solution, or rather, a solution that would require her to take responsibility for a diagnosis she wasn't qualified to manage. Liability was the real disease in emergency medicine. Liability was the cancer that spread faster than any arrhythmia. 3 floors up, Dr. Hargrove sat in his office reviewing spreadsheets that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with mathematics. The margins on veteran billing codes had been generous for 18 months. Very generous. The insurance companies had been paying out, faster than they should have been paying out, on claims that had been submitted with certain code elevations. Certain enhancements. Certain creative interpretations of what complex cardiac evaluation meant when the patient was a 70-year-old vet with PTSD and a pulse. He'd made $87,000 in the last quarter alone. The audit committee at Oak Creek consisted of 4 nurses, 2 insurance liaisons, and 1 hospital administrator. Sarah Chen had joined 3 months ago. She'd asked to join, which was unusual. Most people didn't volunteer for committees that required actual work. She attended every meeting. She read every file. She took notes in a small leather notebook, her handwriting small and precise, and she never said anything. Just listened. Just watched. Dr. Hargrove had noticed her the way you notice a camera in a room, a thing that shouldn't be there, that might be recording something you didn't mean to record. He pulled up the discharge summary he dictated for an 84-year-old veteran who'd come in with pneumonia 3 weeks ago and left with a $60,000 bill padded with cardiac consultations that never actually happened. The veteran had paid $5,000 out of pocket. Insurance had paid the rest. The hospital had kept its cut. Hargrove had kept his. Now there was a blind man on a stretcher in the ER. Hargrove didn't know that yet. But he would know soon. He always did. The resident's call went through to Dr. Yamamoto at 11:18 p.m. Yamamoto was an excellent cardiologist. The kind of cardiologist who understood that certain patients came with certain risks. Blind men. Complicated medical histories. Cases that required documentation. Cases that required actually being in the hospital to defend if something went wrong. Not taking new consults, Yamamoto's voice crackled over the phone, already in motion toward a patient who would definitely need an echocardiogram. Get someone from internal medicine to stabilize. The resident hung up and called Dr. Morrison. Morrison didn't answer. His voicemail said he was unavailable. The resident called Dr. Singh. Singh was in surgery, emergency appendectomy, wouldn't be out for 3 hours. Dr. James was asleep. Dr. Reeves didn't work nights anymore. Dr. Kwan had transferred to Dallas 6 months ago. By 11:24 p.m., 6 doctors had been contacted and 6 doctors had reasons they couldn't take the case. By 11:31 p.m., the number was 8. Dr. Henley cited a scheduling conflict. Dr. Ashford said he'd hit his patient cap for the month. Dr. Michaels didn't answer his phone at all. Sarah was still there, behind the glass, adjusting an 4 flow rate on a patient who didn't need adjusting. She watched the resident's face shift through stages of panic that all looked the same, mouth tightening, eyes widening slightly, that specific slouch of someone who understood they were about to be blamed for something that wasn't their fault. The blind man on the stretcher was still awake. His hands were folded across his stomach. He was breathing fast, too fast, the kind of breathing that meant his body knew something was wrong even if his mind was still catching up. Pain was information. She'd learned that in places she wasn't supposed to have been. Pain was data. And his data was writing a story in shortness of breath and tachycardia that nobody seemed to want to read. By 11:39 p.m., the number was 10. Dr. Hargrove sat at his desk and heard the cascade of rejections moving through the ER like a current nobody could swim against. Word traveled. It always did. A difficult patient. A blind man. Probably other complications. Probably not worth the liability exposure. Probably smarter to let somebody else solve this one. He smiled to himself and returned to his spreadsheets. Sarah made a decision that she would regret tomorrow and thank herself for today. She pulled off her gloves, set them in the biohazard container with the others, and walked toward the ER Bay 3 with the kind of certainty that came from having already survived worse. The resident was standing beside the stretcher, holding a cardiac monitor printout and the weight of a system that had just decided a blind man's problems were too complicated to solve. "Who's taking this?" Sarah asked. Her voice was quiet. Deferential. The voice of someone who understood hierarchy and honored it. "Nobody yet," the resident said. Patterson walked. "Yamoto's not available. Morrison's not answering. Reeves won't come in. James is asleep. Singh's in surgery. Ashford hit his cap. Quan transferred. Michaels didn't pick up. Henley's got a conflict." That was 9. The resident was still making calls. 2 more rejections would come by 11:02 p.m., but Sarah already knew the shape of this story. She'd learned it in places where there were no choices, where someone had to take action because waiting meant death, and death was information nobody wanted to process. She looked at the blind man on the stretcher, and he turned his head toward her footsteps. That was the first time she understood that being seen by someone who couldn't see you was a different kind of visibility altogether. "What's his name?" she asked. "Rodriguez," the resident said. "Victor Rodriguez. 62 years old. Former Special Forces. Out of Walter Reed VA Hospital in D.C. for 3 weeks. Says he had a bad feeling this morning. Came to the ER by himself because his daughter works night shift at another hospital." Sarah nodded. She didn't speak. She had learned that speaking when you weren't supposed to speak caused problems. She had learned that staying invisible kept you safe. But something in the way this man had turned his head toward her footsteps, something in that gesture of recognizing a presence in the dark, made her understand that some problems couldn't be solved by staying invisible. She walked away. Back to the ICU. Back to her invisible work. Back to the place where she belonged, where her hands would be steady and her voice would be small and her life would continue exactly as it had been continuing for 4 years. But her footsteps, as she climbed the stairs back to the 3rd floor, carried the weight of a decision she didn't know she'd already made. The 3rd floor nurses' station buzzed with the particular energy of morning rounds, residents cycling through patients, attending physicians barking orders, the intercom crackling with overhead pages. Sarah moved through it all like she'd learned to move through everything, present but invisible, efficient but unremarkable. She was pulling labs from the printer when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the noise, loud enough that every head in the station lifted. "Chen." "A moment." He didn't wait for her to turn. He spoke to the room instead, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who'd never been told no. "I'm making a wager with the staff here. I'm betting you won't last another week. Any takers?" He smiled, the kind of smile that made the fluorescent light seem colder. "Seriously? Who's got 500? A resident laughed nervously. Another looked away. Sarah's hand stilled on the papers, not trembling, just paused, and she felt the weight of 17 pairs of eyes suddenly aware they were watching something. She could have met his gaze. Could have spoken. Instead, she turned back to the printer and continued filing charts with the same methodical precision she'd used for 4 years, the same precision that had kept casualties alive in conditions where hesitation meant death. Her jaw clenched once, barely visible. Her breathing stayed even. She said nothing. Hargrove watched her for a moment longer, clearly disappointed that she hadn't broken, hadn't protested, hadn't given him the satisfaction of a reaction. He turned to the residents with a shrug and moved toward the elevators, but Sarah felt it, the shift in how he decided to approach her. Direct confrontation wasn't breaking her. He'd need to try something else. That afternoon, the cafeteria was half empty, that strange hospital dead zone between lunch rush and dinner prep. Sarah sat alone at a corner table with a tray of turkey sandwich and soup, her eyes on the chart she'd brought with her, reviewing vitals on the veteran from ER, the one they were still deciding what to do with. She didn't notice Hargrove approaching until he was already beside her. His hip caught the edge of her tray as he walked past. It wasn't clumsy. It was precise. The tray tipped, and suddenly soup was spreading across the table like an accusation, tomato bisque, red as blood, soaking through the papers of her chart. Rice scattered across the tile floor in a white constellation. Hargrove paused 3 steps away, turned back with eyebrows raised in exaggerated surprise. Oh. Butterfingers. He didn't help. Didn't apologize. Didn't even slow down. Just continued walking while 2 other nurses at a nearby table suddenly became very interested in their phones. Sarah sat for exactly 2 seconds without moving. Then she stood, grabbed napkins from the dispenser, and began cleaning. The soup wouldn't come off the chart completely, the paper curled slightly, stained a permanent rust color. She knelt on the tile floor and swept the rice into her palm, aware that Hargrove had paused at the far end of the cafeteria, watching her with the expression of a man testing how much pressure something could take before it shattered. She didn't break. She cleaned. She dumped the ruined chart, retrieved another one from the nursing station, and continued her shift with the same steady hands that had performed emergency field medicine in the middle of Baghdad while mortars fell around her. Hands that had held someone's spine stable while waiting for the medevac. Hands that didn't shake from soup or smirks. But that wasn't the worst part. At 3 o'clock, Sarah was reviewing a patient's post-op discharge paperwork in the 3rd-floor corridor when Hargrove emerged from a room with a patient chart in his hand. He didn't slow down as he approached her. He just released the chart, let it fall, and it scattered across the tile floor at her feet, papers spreading in a fan like accusations. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was silk over iron, the kind of casual cruelty that sounded like kindness if you weren't listening carefully. He smiled. "Unless your back is too delicate for real work." The corridor went absolutely silent. 3 residents stood frozen. A nurse at a nearby computer stopped typing. Even the ventilator sounds from the patient room seemed to pause, as if the entire floor was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Sarah took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from somewhere deeper than lungs, from that place where decisions live, where lines get drawn and redrawn, where a person decides what they will and will not accept. One tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't try to hide it. She let it fall and wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, her gaze locked on Hargrove's like a sniper's sight picture. Her voice came out quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried the kind of weight that made the air pressure change. "I've carried wounded men twice your weight through mortar fire, Doctor." Each word was precisely placed, like charges in a demolition sequence. "Your disrespect weighs nothing at all." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Hargrove's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind his eyes, a moment where the calculation changed, where he understood that standard intimidation tactics weren't going to work on someone who'd already survived things his money and title couldn't touch. He turned and walked away without another word, his jaw working slightly as he moved. Sarah knelt and gathered the scattered papers. The other staff looked away. She reorganized the chart, closed it with deliberate care, and continued her rounds with her back perfectly straight and her hands perfectly steady, because that's what you did when you trained to function in crisis, you moved forward. You didn't look back. You didn't let anyone see that anything had happened at all. That evening, Hargrove sat in his office on the 4th floor with his door closed and his phone pressed to his ear. Through the glass partition, Sarah could see him gesturing silently as he spoke, the kind of urgent, low-toned conversation that belonged to someone who'd just realized they were running out of time. She'd seen the look before, in commanders who'd realized their strategy wasn't working and needed to pivot to something more aggressive. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could read his lips well enough. Chen problem. And then, audit committee. And then, questions about the codes. He made 3 calls in succession, each one shorter than the last, each one punctuated by him setting the phone down hard on the desk like he was hammering a nail. By the time he was finished, his knuckles were white and his breathing had changed, no longer the controlled breath of a man executing a plan, but the ragged breath of someone who'd just realized the game had shifted in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Sarah turned back to her work and didn't watch him anymore. She had more important things to monitor. Down in the ER, a blind captain from Special Forces was still lying in a bed with no assigned care team, his vitals slowly trending in directions they shouldn't go, his name on a chart that nobody seemed willing to pick up. 10 doctors had already passed. And Dr. Hargrove, from his office with the glass walls and the closed door, was making phone calls that suggested he had no intention of letting anyone help him. She'd carried wounded men through worse. She knew exactly what came next. The 10th doctor had just walked out. Sarah watched him disappear through the automatic doors, his discharge summary left unsigned on the counter. 10. She'd counted them all, the cardiologist with the Rolex, the trauma surgeon who glanced at his phone, the hospitalist who muttered something about liability exposure on unvetted cases, the neurologist who didn't even step into the room. 10 successive refusals, each one polite enough to sound reasonable until you understood what was happening. A blind Special Forces veteran with no clear admission diagnosis was being systematically abandoned on a Thursday night at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston. The 10th doctor had been apologetic, at least. That was almost worse. I'm sorry, really. Liability concerns. And honestly, without a clear presenting diagnosis, I'd be guessing. You need someone with more availability. His voice had been gentle, the kind of gentleness that made the refusal seem like kindness. Sarah had nodded, documented his decline professionally, and felt something cold settle in her chest as she watched him leave. That was when she made the choice that would change everything. She walked back to the ER bay where the veteran sat, late 50s, military bearing even in a hospital gown, sightless eyes pointed at nothing. His name was Victor Rodriguez. Captain Victor Rodriguez, the chart said, though it took her a moment to connect the name to the memory. Baghdad. 2009, a letter Danny had written home about his commanding officer, about how Captain Rodriguez had carried 2 wounded Marines out of Anbar province under fire, about how he'd lost his eyes in an IED blast 6 weeks later. The same letter that ended with Captain Rodriguez says he doesn't regret a single day. Sarah approached the bed. Captain, I'm Sarah Chen. I'm going to be your nurse tonight. He turned toward her voice, and something flickered across his face, recognition without sight. Chen. You have a son. I do. Sergeant Daniel Chen. Watched him grow from private to squad leader. Good kid. Better soldier. He paused. Better man than most. The words landed like weight. Sarah's hand steadied. He spoke of you. Often. How is he? Safe. Home. Stateside now. Rodriguez nodded slowly, and Sarah saw the thing the other 10 doctors had missed, the man beneath the disability, the competence beneath the blindness, the command presence that had nothing to do with vision. He was a warrior. He would expect her to act like one. I'm taking your case, sir, she said. Whatever you need. He smiled then, slight and knowing. Thank you, Chief. She didn't correct him. Maybe he knew. Maybe in his own way, without sight, he could see things the others couldn't. The shift moved into its rhythm. Sarah monitored his vitals every hour, BP stable at 118/76, heart rate calm at 58, respirations easy. He seemed stable. Almost unremarkable. She charted medication changes, ensured his fall was patent, updated his standing orders. The night stretched quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical monotony. Rain began to hammer against the ER windows like distant gunfire. At 1:45 a.m., Sarah returned for routine vitals. She'd done this check 1,000 times. Blood pressure cuff. Pulse ox on his finger. Temp reading. Standard, automatic, the kind of work her hands could do while her mind processed deeper things. She reached for his arm to take his blood pressure and stopped. His skin was cold. Not cool from the hospital air, cold like a body in shock. She pressed the cuff inflated against his arm. The machine beeped. Numbers appeared. Her breath caught. She hit the button again. Same reading. 70/40. His pulse was thready, fluttering beneath her fingertips like a bird with a broken wing, barely registering, too fast and too weak. 60 seconds. 90 seconds. Barely there at all. His respirations were shallow, rapid, the breathing of someone drowning from the inside. Cardiac tamponade. She knew it the way field medics know the smell of burning hair, instantly, completely, with zero room for doubt. Fluid was compressing his heart. His ventricles couldn't fill. His cardiac output was collapsing. Without immediate intervention, he had minutes. Maybe 4. Maybe less. Sarah moved. No hesitation. No internal debate. Her hands were already reaching for the call button, the one that summoned the code team, that brought the attending physicians running, that mobilized every resource the hospital possessed. She hit it hard. The light activated above the bay. The intercom crackled. She hit it again, pressed it a second time for emphasis. Nothing. Nobody came. She waited 10 seconds. 12. 15. Rodriguez's breathing was getting worse. His skin was turning the color of ash. She could see the internal collapse happening in real time, the oxygen desaturation, the metabolic failure, the heart that was losing its battle minute by minute. Sarah ran. The nurse's station was empty. All 3 positions are vacant. The ER corridor stretched silent, fluorescent lights throwing everything into sharp relief. She could hear the ventilators humming in distant trauma bays, the faint electronic beeping of monitors from other rooms, but no human voices. No one staffing the station at 1:45 a.m. when the night shift should have been fully present. She found Dr. Hargrove in the physician's lounge. He was sitting in the leather recliner, the expensive one that the attending always claimed, drinking coffee black from a ceramic mug that said Medical Director in gold lettering. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sir, Captain Rodriguez is coding. Cardiac tamponade. He needs immediate pericardiocentesis." Her voice was level, professional, the voice of a senior chief petty officer reporting a tactical situation to command. Hargrove slowly lowered his coffee. He met her eyes with the kind of casual disdain that comes from absolute certainty of power. "Call the attending." "You are the attending tonight, sir." "Then I'm delegating." "Call cardiology." He raised the mug back to his lips. "He'll be dead before they arrive." Sarah's composure didn't crack. Her hands didn't shake. Inside, something was moving, something that had learned patience through 17 years of military discipline. "Captain Rodriguez has 4 minutes, maximum. Cardiology is 8 minutes out from the nearest station. He needs the procedure now. Then document the time of death appropriately." Hargrove's voice was conversational, the tone of someone discussing a scheduling inconvenience. "We're not equipped for that procedure on a blind veteran with no clear medical history. Liability nightmare. You understand?" The words hung in the cold air of the lounge. Sarah felt them land, understood exactly what he was doing. The phantom billing. The deleted diagnostic codes. The insurance money that disappeared into accounts with Hargrove's name attached. Rodriguez's actual treatment would generate real medical records that would expose the fraud immediately. A pericardiocentesis performed on a patient with cardiac tamponade was standard emergency medicine. But it would also create documentation, procedure notes, fluid analysis, images, expert consultation. All of it traceable. Rodriguez was valuable to Hargrove. But only if he was dead. Sarah thought of her son's letter, still in the drawer at home. She thought of Danny's handwriting describing how Captain Rodriguez had carried a wounded Marine through killing fire because that was what command meant, you didn't leave people behind. She thought of the pair of worn combat boots in her locker, scuffed and creased, boots that had walked through places Hargrove would never comprehend, boots that had stood ground when every fiber screamed to run. "Step aside, Doctor." Her voice had changed. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. It had the quality of steel moving against stone, quiet, final, capable of cutting through anything if given pressure and time. She walked past him. Walked past the luxury leather chair and the ceramic mug and the man whose cold calculation she could smell like ozone after a defibrillator discharge. She walked back toward the ER, back toward the bay where Captain Rodriguez was running out of heartbeats. "If you touch that patient, you're fired." Hargrove's voice followed her down the corridor. It sounded almost panicked now, the confidence sliding into something sharper. "I'm documenting that statement. Insubordination. You'll never work in another hospital in this state." Sarah didn't turn around. She moved through the ER corridor with the fluid precision of someone who'd made decisions under fire before. The code cart was standard, she'd known where it was stored since her first shift 3 years ago. She pulled it, and the wheels squeaked against the tile floor like brakes on a convoy truck. The equipment inside was familiar, the sterile trays, the syringes already prepared, the needles and catheters and sterile drapes. She thought of the field hospitals in Baghdad, of the light of an oil lamp illuminating a surgical table, of Captain Rodriguez's blood type and the fluid balance she'd calculated in seconds. Her muscle memory took over. Hands that had held lives together moved without hesitation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that nobody stopped her. Not one doctor emerged from the physician's lounge to physically prevent her. Not one administrator appeared to block the code cart. Hargrove made his calls, she could hear his voice from a distance, tight and controlled, speaking to people whose names she didn't know, people who would probably investigate later, people who would eventually build the case that would require her to disappear. But in the moment when it mattered, when a man was dying and only one person in the building had the training to save him, nobody moved to stop her. She returned to Captain Rodriguez's bay, pulled on sterile gloves, and understood that she'd just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. The blue gloves snapped onto her hands like the sound of weapons being armed. The smell of antiseptic flooded the small space. The fluorescent lights cast everything in clinical white. Rodriguez was still conscious enough to know something was happening. His sightless eyes tracked the sound of her movement. "What are you doing, Chief?" "My job, sir," Sarah said. And she began. At 2:03 a.m. Sarah returned to the bay where Captain Rodriguez lay dying. The monitor beeped its arrhythmia in the fluorescent silence, each beat more desperate than the last. His skin had taken on that waxy pallor she recognized from a field tent in Kandahar where the walls breathed with concussion and blood ran in channels across the surgical floor. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. Not under lights. In darkness, with mortar rounds shaking the canvas poles, with rounds cracking overhead like bullwhips, with her hand steady because steadiness was the difference between a man going home to his daughter and a flag-draped box going home instead. Sarah gathered the equipment. 18-gauge needle. Local anesthetic. Chlorhexidine swabs. The tray clattered softly, a sound like distant shells. She prepped the site at the cardiac notch, her fingers finding the landmarks with the kind of muscle memory that transcended 18 years of hospital work and reached back to something older, something that lived in her bones. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle. Her hand didn't shake. Not anymore. Not now. The fluid came back. Dark. Crimson. 30 milliliters of blood pooling in the syringe as she withdrew. 30 milliliters that would have killed him in the next 6 minutes. The pressure in his chest had been crushing his heart, suffocating it, drowning it. Now the needle was drawing that pressure away like poison from a wound. Captain Rodriguez gasped. His color shifted. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Just the small return of something human to his face, the difference between a man slipping away and a man remembering how to breathe. His blood pressure rose. 70. 80. 85. His pulse steadied from the panic gallop it had been to something approaching rhythm. His oxygen saturation climbed. 88. 90. 92. Sarah sat back. Her hands were shaking now. Strange how that worked, steady through the crisis, trembling after. She'd learned that response in Fallujah, where the adrenaline kept you functional until the moment you stopped functioning, and then your whole body became a tuning fork resonating with everything you'd survived. Rodriguez's eyes moved beneath closed lids. His mouth opened. Who are you? His voice like wind through a broken window, confused, gasping. She didn't answer. By 6:48 a.m., Dr. Hargrove had made 7 phone calls. The hospital administrator received the first, a message marked urgent, voice tight with controlled fury, "We have a serious incident. Unauthorized procedure. Scope violation. Nurse Chen exceeded her authority and I want her terminated before she can fabricate documentation." By 6:15 a.m., board members' personal cell phones began ringing. Before they'd finished their first coffee, before they'd even left their houses, they knew there was an unstable employee who needed immediate action. By 6:45 a.m., an investigator from the State Medical Board had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial's lobby with a leather briefcase and a list of questions nobody wanted asked. Hargrove had filed the complaints at 5:08 a.m., unauthorized procedure, practicing beyond scope, falsifying credentials, and then made the calls that terrified him most. Calls requesting background checks. Calls asking for military records. Calls demanding any evidence of instability, any history, any weakness he could weaponize. He'd learned that the real vulnerability wasn't what someone couldn't do. It was who they'd been before. At 8:38 a.m., Sarah was called to the administrator's office on the 4th floor. She walked through corridors that suddenly felt different, staff averted their eyes, conversation stopped mid-sentence, the usual chaos of shift change had crystallized into something cold and deliberate. 2 security officers flanked her. Not threatening. Not yet. Just present. Just making clear that she wasn't being asked. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Wells whose signature was on compliance documents Sarah had reviewed during her audit work, sat behind her desk with 2 thick folders open. "We've received serious allegations," Patricia began. "From Dr. Hargrove. About a procedure you performed without authorization. Without an attending. Beyond your scope of practice." Sarah said nothing. "Your nursing license is in jeopardy. The hospital's accreditation is potentially affected. We need to understand what you were thinking." Patricia's voice had that false sympathy people used when they'd already decided. When the words were just theater. "The patient was in cardiac tamponade," Sarah said. Her voice was different now, flatter, more precise. His blood pressure was 70/38. His pulse was 142. No attending was available. The patient would have died in minutes without intervention. "You're not a physician," Patricia said quietly. "No," Sarah agreed. "I'm someone who knows what death looks like, and I wasn't going to watch it happen while following a chain of command that had already failed that patient 10 times over." Patricia's face tightened. "We'll need your badge. You're being placed on immediate suspension pending a termination hearing, scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10. Security will escort you through the facility to retrieve your personal items." The security officers stood. Sarah stood. Her locker was on the 3rd floor, in the staff area behind the break room where she'd hung her coat every night for 9 years. When they got there, one officer photographed her belongings before she packed them. The pair of worn combat boots came out last, the leather cracked, the laces knotted and re-knotted 100 times, the soles worn through in specific patterns only a specific kind of walking created. The officer photographed them carefully. "Evidence of instability," he said, not unkindly. As if boots could tell a story worth telling. Sarah walked out through the front entrance of Oak Creek Memorial at 9:15 a.m. The morning was hot already, Houston heat pressing down like a physical thing. She was still wearing her scrubs. Still wearing her coat. The badge that had granted her access to every floor, every code, every crisis moment, was gone. In her hands were a cardboard box containing the fragments of 18 years. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. That moment came at precisely 9:17 a.m., when automated security systems at the Pentagon triggered an alert. Dr. Hargrove's records request had hit classified databases. The request was being flagged. The name Sarah Chen had pinged against a file marked Eyes Only, classified operation, identity erased, do not surface. Within seconds, a lieutenant commander at Naval Special Warfare Command in San Diego saw the alert. Within 90 seconds, an FBI field office supervisor in the Houston division received a phone call from Washington. Within 3 minutes, a number that didn't officially exist received an urgent priority message. Sarah was sitting in her car in the parking lot, hands on the steering wheel, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. Senior Chief, the voice said. Male. Military cadence. Authority in every syllable. This is Commander Hayes with Naval Special Warfare Command. We have a situation. Stand by for asset relocation. Sarah's hand went steady. Her breathing regulated. The buried parts of her answered before the nurse part could respond. Standing by, sir. Someone initiated a record search into your classified history. That triggers protocols. We're activating the extraction team. You have 6 hours to secure your daughter and prepare to move. There will be questions. There will be a hearing. And then we'll sort out whether you disappear again or whether this time you get to stay visible. Either way, nobody gets to bury a medal holder twice. The line went dead. Sarah sat in the silence of her car, the box of her civilian life in the seat beside her, and for the first time in 18 years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that invisible might not be permanent. That some secrets, once they start breaking free, couldn't be pushed back into darkness. That sometimes the people who loved you most were the ones who finally insisted you stop hiding. She started the car. The morning pressed on. And Houston, for all its heat and sprawl and indifference, had no idea it was about to collide with classified. Security walked Sarah out at 9:19 a.m. 2 officers flanked her, not roughly, but with the professional efficiency of people following protocol. Her scrub still held the smell of antiseptic and Captain Rodriguez's blood. The badge they'd taken hung from one guard's belt. The fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial's corridor seemed to pulse faster as they moved, or maybe that was just the sound of her heartbeat in her ears. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said goodbye. Nurses stared at their monitors. Doctors found sudden interest in patient charts. The thing about invisibility is you get very good at recognizing when it's deliberate. By the time they reached the employee lot, it wasn't invisibility anymore. It was erasure. Her coat was still in her locker. She'd thrown it on over the scrubs because there was no time for anything else. The walk to her car took 43 seconds. She counted each one. The November air hit cold against her face, carrying diesel exhaust from the ambulance bay and something else, the metallic tang of her own adrenaline wearing off. Her hand stayed steady on the steering wheel. Hands that had held bleeding soldiers. Hands that had performed pericardiocentesis at 2 a.m. with O2 climbing, with Rodriguez's blood pressure crawling up from 70/40 as the fluid drained and his heart found rhythm again. Those same hands gripped the wheel like she was trying to keep the car from flying apart. She drove to the safe house her daughter didn't know about, the one she'd rented for years ago under a shell company, just in case. Except there was no in case anymore. There was only Jennifer waiting after school at her grandmother's house, and her mother would pick her up, and Sarah would miss that pickup for the first time since Danny died, and somewhere in a Pentagon office, someone was looking at her buried file and making phone calls. The thing about classified operations is they don't stay classified when someone starts digging. Hargrove's search had triggered alerts. She knew it the moment security escorted her out. The calculation was already running: how long until the military found out she'd broken orders, that she'd stayed in Houston, that she'd been working as a nurse instead of being erased like they'd asked. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table still wearing her scrubs and coat. Jennifer came home at 5:18 p.m., dropped her backpack by the door, and stopped. Her 9-year-old daughter had the kind of instinct kids develop when they've already lost a father. She could read the weight in a room like sonar. "Why are you home, Mommy? You're supposed to be at work." The question was small. Careful. Did something happen? Sarah opened her mouth. Closed it. The composure she'd built for 4 years, the one that had let her move through Oak Creek Memorial unnoticed, the one that had kept her voice steady while Dr. Hargrove threw charts and made bets, cracked. Not visibly. Not dramatically. Just a single tear that escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away immediately, but Jennifer had already seen. Sarah had spent for years making sure Jennifer never saw her cry. Not after the phone call about Danny. Not after the nights alone. Not after the orders to disappear, to become someone else, to erase herself so completely that even her daughter had learned to accept the half-truths, that Mommy worked nights, that Mommy was tired, that Mommy couldn't talk about some things. Jennifer climbed into her lap. Her daughter was getting too big for this, nearly reaching Sarah's chin now, but she settled there anyway, and Sarah held her the way she'd held wounded Marines, carefully, like they might break. "I got in trouble at work," Sarah said quietly. "But I did the right thing. So they let me go." It was closer to truth than lie. Jennifer didn't ask for more. She just breathed against Sarah's collarbone, and Sarah felt something in her chest that had been locked away for 4 years finally break open. The termination hearing was scheduled for 8 a.m. the next morning at Oak Creek Memorial's administrative offices. Sarah didn't think the blind veteran would come. Why would he? She'd saved his life, that was the debt paid. But at 7:53 a.m., Captain Webb was wheeled into the hearing room by an aide, his service dog resting across his knees. He wore his uniform. That detail registered before anything else. He'd gotten dressed in navy dress whites for a hearing about his own case, because that's what warriors do. They show up in full kit. The board members sat in a line like judges, Dr. Hargrove at the center with a smile that suggested he'd already written the verdict, 3 hospital administrators in business suits, the chief of staff with her jaw clenched, and at the far end, a nurse administrator Sarah had never spoken to, holding a manila folder stamped confidential in red letters. Sarah entered at 8:07 a.m. The protocol was she would stand while they explained the charges. Her response would be recorded. Then they would vote. She knew how this went. Knew the mathematics of power. But Captain Webb turned his head toward her footsteps. He couldn't see her, but he'd learned to read the particular sound of movement in a room, the pressure change of a body crossing a threshold. His head swiveled maybe 15 degrees. And he whispered, so quietly only Sarah heard it, "Phantom." Her call sign. Her classified call sign. The one from Baghdad, from the extraction operation in 2019, from the 3-year period the Pentagon had ordered erased from every database. Her hands didn't shake. But her breath caught, and that tiny sound was enough. Jennifer stood from the gallery. Sarah hadn't known her daughter was here until she stood, and then the entire room shifted. Jennifer's voice was small but clear. She'd been coached, or instinct had taught her, because she said it with the precision of someone giving testimony. "That's my mom." Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen. The Chief of Staff's eyes widened. The administrative board members exchanged glances. Dr. Hargrove's smile faltered for exactly half a second, just long enough for Sarah to see him realize something had changed, though not yet what. The nurse administrator opened the manila folder with trembling hands. She'd been reading from it for maybe 3 minutes before Sarah understood the Pentagon had sent someone. Not physically, the information had come through official channels, but the file itself contained details that shouldn't exist. Classified operations in Baghdad, 2018 to 2019. Kandahar extraction, 2019. Then the nurse began listing something else, and her voice cracked slightly. According to Joint Service records, Senior Chief Chen was awarded the Navy Cross for actions under fire on March 14, 2019. Silver Star on. She paused, looked up at Sarah, then back down. 2 silver stars. Both for heroic action protecting wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire. The room had the particular silence that comes when the mathematics of power suddenly invert. Dr. Hargrove leaned back in his chair like he was recalculating. A door opened at the back of the conference room. A man in Navy dress whites, insignia reading Commander, walked to stand beside Captain Webb. A SEAL team leader. Sarah recognized him, had served with him, though not by that name, not officially. He nodded once at Sarah, then turned to address the board. Senior Chief Chen saved my commanding officer's life at Oak Creek Memorial on the morning of November 22nd. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without authorization because an attending physician refused to treat the patient. The patient is a Special Forces officer who served with honor and distinction. The SEAL paused. His voice dropped an octave. Senior Chief Chen served with honor and distinction. Full stop. Her actions that night were consistent with her training and her character. Both exceptional. Then the FBI agent walked in. Just like that. Dark suit, credentials, the particular gravity of someone carrying the weight of federal investigation. He addressed the board directly. We've been investigating Dr. Hargrove for 6 months regarding systematic fraud in veteran care billing. Charges include falsification of medical records, inflation of procedure codes, and conspiracy to embezzle insurance payouts to the tune of approximately $3,417,000 across a 3-year period. When Dr. Hargrove attempted to access and falsify Senior Chief Chen's personnel file yesterday morning, it triggered federal alerts. That attempt, combined with existing evidence, has provided probable cause for immediate arrest. The agents moved with the fluid precision of people who'd done this before. Handcuffs clicked around Dr. Hargrove's wrists. His face had gone the color of old parchment. He didn't resist, there was no point, but Sarah watched as the weight of exposure settled on him, as he finally understood that the network he'd built, the allies he'd cultivated, had all evaporated the moment federal investigators arrived. The agents led him out of the conference room at 8:34 a.m. They didn't hurry. They let him walk past the nurses' station where he'd made his bet, where Sarah would quit within a week, where 2 nurses now stood with their hands covering their mouths. They walked him past the cafeteria where he'd knocked her tray to the floor, where a line cook glanced up and looked away. The perp walk continued through the ICU, past the very bay where Captain Rodriguez was recovering, where Rodriguez watched from his bed and said something to his nurse that made her squeeze his hand. By noon, the local news had cameras in the parking lot. By 1 p.m., 3 board members had resigned. By evening, federal auditors had arrived with boxes and were removing files. Jennifer slept against Sarah's shoulder that night. They sat together on the living room couch, and Sarah's phone had rung at 7:22 p.m., Department of Veterans Affairs, offering her a position. Director of Veteran Services, Houston VA Hospital. Starting immediately. Reporting to a general who'd known Danny, who'd written the letter to Sarah for years ago asking her to disappear, to stop being visible because being visible meant being vulnerable to the intelligence community, to the operations that had marked her, to the missions that couldn't be acknowledged. The general's voice on the phone was different now. Apologetic, maybe. Your son was a good man, he'd said. You were a good soldier. Come home. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her dress uniform outside the Houston VA hospital. Her Navy Cross hung at her collar, the full medal, not the ribbon, because the general had insisted she wear the full honors. Inside her new office, Captain Webb's worn combat boots sat on a shelf next to the photograph of Danny in Baghdad, grinning in front of a Humvee, alive in a way that still made her chest tighten. The boots were a gift Webb had given her on her first day, so you remember, he'd said, some people are worth the cost of being seen. She passed a strip mall on her drive home one evening in early May. Through the window of a small storefront, she saw Dr. Hargrove sitting at a folding table beneath fluorescent lights, a stack of insurance brochures in front of him, his hair completely gray now, his hand shaking slightly as he organized the papers. His medical license was revoked permanently. He was awaiting trial on 43 separate counts of fraud and conspiracy. Sarah didn't slow down. Didn't look at him directly. Just kept walking, because the thing about finally being seen is you don't need to see the people who tried to erase you. At the VA, she'd implemented new protocols. No veteran refused care. Ever. 10 staff members had transferred from Oak Creek to work with her. Jennifer volunteered in the outreach program after school, teaching other military kids that their parents' sacrifice meant something. Webb visited twice a week, his guide dog at his side, teaching trauma response to corpsmen, his blind eyes fixed on something beyond the room, the kind of vision that comes from having already sacrificed everything and surviving anyway. One afternoon, Sarah asked him something she'd never had the courage to say. Why did you demand to come to that hearing? You could have let it go. You were safe. Webb's hand found his dog's head. You went back into a burning building for a blind man you barely knew. Some things you don't walk away from. He paused. Besides, you were the only one in that hospital who saw me. Actually saw me. Not the disability. Not the liability. Just saw me. That's worth getting dressed up for. Her phone buzzed at 4:56 p.m. that same day. A new patient incoming. Special Forces, recently returned from overseas. No other hospital willing to take the case. Complex PTSD, mild TBI, everyone else's assumption he was too damaged to be worth the effort. Sarah picked up her coat without hesitation. Jennifer grabbed her own as they headed toward the door. Not all heroes wear capes, Sarah said quietly as they walked out into the afternoon sun. Some wear scrubs and carry stethoscopes and save lives when nobody's watching. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that the quiet people in hospitals and offices and neighborhoods deserve to be seen, deserve to be honored, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment sharing your own story of being underestimated and proving them wrong. Because the heroes among us are often invisible until the moment they refuse to be.